He's like a modern-day Tarzan, the narrator says of all-purpose animal wrangler Ross Allen. We're watching Catching Trouble, episode 315, short subject, and Ross is stalking the Everglades in button-down and shorts, tracking down wild bear cubs, monkeys, and snakes for export to zoos around the country. It's clear neither what's so modern about Ross nor what's so antiquated about Tarzan. Edgar Rice Burroughs' classic Enfant Terrible has just been updated for today's audiences, and Tarzan the Ape Man and Tarzan and His Mate. And thoroughly modern Johnny Weissmuller is roughly as popular as Groucho. If he falls outside the social norm, and clearly he does, this is more a function of his being out of place than out of time. The reason for his unfamiliarity with the rituals of urban Western life is that he's grown up not in the past, but in the jungle. Ross Allen's slacks, meanwhile, are about the only modern thing about him. He doesn't use fancy tricks, boxing stick traps, weights that snatch up webs of rope from the forest floor to bag his quarry. Instead, he imitates these creatures. If he's after a rattlesnake, he twists and dances. If he's chasing a bear cub, he scrambles behind it on all fours, swatting paws until the critter stumbles and he gets a chance to tackle it. The narrator has gotten it wrong. What Ross and Tarzan really have in common is their disinterest in technological invention in favor of the ways of nature in the animal kingdom. Tarzan's relationship with Mother Earth speaks for itself, but Ross, too, clearly knows mammals and the soil, whatever one might think of his methods. They commune with nature and aver technological innovation, Ross and Tarzan. They do their work with tools no more sophisticated than lassos, nets, and vines. What's everyone worried about in 1936, and why are they going out to mimic animals in the woods? American subjectivity in the middle 1930s is determined, most of us know, by the Great Depression and the privation of the years previous. For most of the workaday sort, the excesses of the Roaring '20s were something you read about in the paper. Times before that weren't terrific shakes either. It's true that the Great War had administered a kind of sugar high to America. The country had entered late and suffered fewer losses than its European allies. Before this, the United States had struggled with the excesses of its unique capitalist project. A kind of breakaway civilization and a reformation of the European Old World, America had won a vindication in the nightmare of the Great War, and before that the Napoleonic Wars that came in the wake of the French Revolution. America had a bloody civil conflict of its own, but since then, the business of America had been business, and it had presented a model of human society that seemed less liable to bloodshed than that of its European counterparts. This all goes to a conflict essential to human existence. In fact, maybe the essential conflict of this existence. How can our species form a society that does the most good for the most citizens? This is something we've been scratching our head over since we first climbed down out of the trees. In this moment, the globe is languishing in the aftermath of a war engineered in the old continent of Europe, one imperfectly remedied via Woodrow Wilson's intervention. Of the two models for organizing civilization, Europe's and the New World's, America's looks better, and after all, this is the project of the human enterprise, progress. Dreaming up a better life and making it real. There have been many philosophical and narrative allegories that try to clarify or contemplate the isolated human subject's relationship to its surrounding universe. Lately, though, we mainly stick to two. They come up alternately and collectively in just about every high school or college philosophy class. When a student asks that inevitable question beleaguering adolescence, whether reality, typically embodied in a hastily chosen classroom chair, is really there. Both allegories are peculiarly abstract and geometric, but they both simply and efficiently illustrate basic problems in human knowing and being. They also suggest the idea of progress, the idea that by existing, processes and people of necessity evolve, improve, and develop over time. The first, naturally, is Plato's Allegory of the Cave. This fundamental meditation, preserved from the ancient world and much discussed into the Enlightenment in the present day, has slaves in chains gazing at shadows cast on a cave wall by noblemen who seek to control them. This they do all their lives, never learning of the machinations behind their servitude, never learning that they're servants in the first place. They presumably imagine theirs to be lives lived to the fullest, where it's never occurred to them to imagine any other kind of life at all. One chosen soul breaks free of these bonds, but it's never quite clear whether this is because he belongs to a privileged few. Maybe it's simply done for the convenience of advancing the narrative. The other allegory distills a short contemplation by Edwin Abbott in the last century, what seems to be like dizzy pub talk, refined into a rough, short thesis. A bar napkin joke, it could also be a lesson plan. In Flatland, Abbott, an English teacher by trade, posits sentient geometric forms, living circles, squares, and lines, that one day begin to float off the flat plane of their existence and witness their abstracted realm for the first time in 3 dimensions. This mind-expanding experience sparks a social revolution, and by the 1930s, the book is commonly taught in classrooms. As in the allegory of the cave, in Flatland, ideas are traded with ease via conversation. Those speaking inhabit, as it were, a space above the immediate proceedings, an advantage provided in both cases by the story's conceit. Abbott calls it omnividence. They float over society as they comment on it, inhabiting a realm only accessible to philosophers and gods. In real life, messages and observations traverse physical distances, and these distances can be vast. Even the upper classes have commented on the difficulties this presents, such as Jane Austen, who in her 1813 novel Pride and Prejudice discusses the challenges of the elite Bennet family in planning parties, balls, and gatherings. The bulk of the challenge involves getting social invitations to their meant recipients in time. For the wealthy, these invitations needed to be sent by barouche landau, a fast 4-horse carriage, and even then communiques took days or weeks to arrive at their destination. For the poor and working classes and those who lived in cities, messages simply did not span long distances. The problems of such classes were only of concern to the omnivident philosophers of works like Flatland, who lumped them into straight lines, squares, and circles, and advised them to better themselves before they could be worthy of further discussion. Flatland makes an obsession of the fin de siècle, the upcoming resetting of the tens column in the Gregorian calendar year. Abbott was pretty forward-looking in this. In 1884, the end of the century wasn't yet on many people's minds. As good popular writers do, Abbott overstates his conceit. He does this by including not just the ends of centuries, but those of millennia as part of Flatland's concern. The alien beings who visit the narrator had crossed the Rubicon of dimensional existence once before, on New Year's Eve of the year 999. And they've had to wait so long because only when calendrical alignments of this magnitude occur can this bridge in dimensional realities be forged. Here an ontological and epistemological problem presents itself. Never mind the fact that most potential New Year's revelers were otherwise disposed, trying to pull themselves out of the Dark Ages, and more to the point, they hadn't even decided which calendar to use in the first place. Flatland can imagine this occasion to be one of note because of the abstracted hypothetical universe Abbott has created, which is why Flatlanders follow the Gregorian calendar even though it didn't come into popular use until the 16th century. Thus, the idea of a New Year's Eve in the year 999 is a mercurial blob that can never quite be pinpointed. When was this event exactly when no one celebrated it, and the calendar on which it would be plotted wouldn't come into existence for another 500 years? The more tangible New Year's of 1899 was observed without particular tumult, save for an economic depression in America and some isolated occasions of hysteria around the globe. A calmness overtook the aesthetic of Western literature and thought, one challenged as always by the ongoing roil of class conflict, but ameliorated by the resetting of the calendar. Low-numbered years tend to be more restful, late-numbered ones more restive. Tangible social factors can easily override this background effect, so that, for instance, the Great War eclipsed the contemplative glow of the early 20th century, but this background effect persists, a kind of heartbeat that has started to pulse through the species over the span of geological time. It will throb once a century and once harder each millennium, for as long as the Gregorian calendar remains the one of record. British writer E. M. Forster chronicled the mellow mood of the early 20th century. His novels A Room with a View, Howard's End, and A Passage to India became bestsellers in England and America, but in the early years of the century he produced 2 short stories that are particularly relevant to the attempt at a contemporary history you are reading now. The first, The Story of a Panic, describes a supernatural event at a picnic in the English countryside. An upper-middle-class family has undertaken this sojourn to get themselves sorted with the help of Mother Nature. A dispute rises between photo-happy Janet and Leyland, an overbearing aesthete who has come along for the ride. Janet has contentedly painted a subpar watercolor of a nearby cathedral, which work has invited offhand comment. "Oh, what a perfectly lovely place," the narrator's daughter Rose declares. "What a picture it would make." This invites a rebuke from the pedantic Leyland, who believes certain vistas to be unworthy of rendering or remembering. Some of nature's angles are too sharp to merit mortal recreation. Some moments in existence are beneath the need for preservation. They're simply nature fulfilling itself. Forster's second tale, The Machine Stops, has a variant of the Babbage engine that conquers human society. Once succumbed to well-designed calculators, the subjects stop making decisions for themselves. Instead, a centralized mechanical overlord does it for them. The inhabitants of this hypothetical future accept the arrangement. It makes things easier for them. By the mid-1930s, information has started to trickle down into the hands of the working class. Messages travel across the country quickly now, mostly through radio, the newspapers, and teletype, but also through the relatively new invention of the sound motion picture and the even newer invention of the television. The screens of the motion picture theater, since their inception, have been closely associated with the pursuit of capital and with the subtle forms of persuasion that go hand in hand with such pursuit. Television's origins aren't much different. The curiously named Philo T. Farnsworth, who usually gets credit for its invention, is rumored to have chosen the image of a $sign as the first to be transmitted over the prototype. Were he and his financial backers gleefully foreseeing the financial windfall that the new device would soon be sending his way? Or were they intuiting the television's true purpose, the essence underlying every flickering image it would ever put into viewers' minds? Farnsworth also edged out a number of competitors to win his good fortune, many of them working while unaware of their fellows laboring at the same task in other parts of the world. This was an idea whose time would seem to have come. Humanity was following some predestined, nearly mystical procession of ever more sophisticated innovations, from telegraph to radio, initially called the enhanced telegraph, to television, to whatever was to come next, some procession imprinted either in the human mind or the fabric of the universe itself. 1936 and the years leading up see their share of novel objects. Insulux, a way of pressing instead of blowing glass to make translucent substitutes for cinder blocks. Congested city streets sort themselves through the use of a timer that forces drivers to pay to park in high-demand downtown spots. 1936 sees the realization of Da Vinci's vertical launch aircraft. As they facilitate state power, solve long-standing problems, or enable people to accomplish the previously impossible, these inventions also altered their perception, changed the definition of visceral concepts we use to orient and ground ourselves. With a field radio, explorers can close the distance between each other, but it makes the idea of distance feel more eluctable, steals some of its weight. The all-glass building built with Insulux in Toledo, Ohio, in January smears the distinction between indoor and out, public and private, seen and hidden. Apple of Leonardo's eye, the helicopter, enables one, with difficulty, to hover and so see from a perspective once largely reserved for mythical deities and the rising souls of the presently deceased. You'll find no parking meters in Undersea Kingdom's lost continent of Atlantis. This futuristic serial, episodes 406 and 409, short subjects, in the vein of Flash Gordon, has little time for contemporaneous innovations. Instead, it features either stylized takes on technologies that are already old. There are a lot of boxy military tanks, for instance, or flights of fantabulous fancy, as when evil Unga Khan targets our heroes with the flying torpedo, a slant-launched rocket that magically changes course to find its mark. Who could think of such a thing? Tangentially, though, one recent innovation that does get a cameo in Undersea Kingdom is civilian aerial bombardment. We've been seeing quite a lot of this lately in real life. As was typical of him, H.G. Wells was among the first civilians to brood on the prospect of harnessing air power to wipe out cities. In *Of Things to Come, published in 1933, he warns that it could be the downfall of the human species. This is a charitable appraisal of humanity's latent gift for self-destruction. True, the Great War had stolen whole generations of young men from 4 Eurasian nations, but the systematic extinction-level carnage Wells foresaw was something else entirely. Prophetic as he so often was, this time the men in uniform, working in secret, had got him beat by a decade or so. In the wake of the war, with its experiments in attrition bombing by Zeppelin and biplane, students of armed conflict had meditated behind closed doors on the subject. Some concluded that wartime urban conflagration would usher in a quicker armistice by inflicting unacceptable losses at a rate manifold higher than even continental battlefield warfare. Others thought it such a devastating tactic, surely no nation would ever employ it, since any nation would be loath to endure the reprisal. Unlike civilian planners, military ones review maps in the interest not of assembling social systems, but of taking them apart. They target industrial, agricultural, commercial, and residential zones to fulfill different aims: halting enemy production, starving the population, and demoralizing or exterminating them, respectively. In the interest of analytical efficacy, these planners abstract cities into grids, imposing a harsh Cartesian uniformity on vast organic colonies of human life. The theory and practice of civilian bombardment bear a curious parallel. From the bridge of his battleship, the captain sees something different than what strategists see when they manipulate that battleship on a war room tabletop. The military planner's god-eye view, the tactical map, is like what the bombardier sees as he flies over his target. This is a new way of understanding urban concentration, one in which cities, as Ken Hollings puts it, carry within them the blueprints for their own ruins. It's small surprise when, thousands of miles and thousands of leagues away, Unga unwittingly borrows the wicked tactics that have so recently disquieted H.G. Wells. Unga's air assault on the White Hats in Atlantis' sacred city, executed by a sky chariot, a cross between a biplane and a zeppelin, has the contraption fly over the temple, incendiaries cascading from its underbelly, the camera tracking both aircraft and target from overhead. Undersea Kingdom being a Poverty Row serial, all this is clumsily rendered with miniatures, marking the sky chariot's target as both actual and representation. It's a tabletop fake we're to take as the real thing, but it looks more like a floor plan than a life-size fortress. The movie makers are in a mindset similar to the bomb planners, using maps to envision destruction of the innocent, confusing the map with the territory by rendering Sacred City as a model, a place and a map simultaneously, both place and map, but also neither. Useful. Unga finds technological screens useful in tracking interloping surface dwellers. A glass display mounted on a finned icebox-sized cabinet, Unga's reflector plate lets him spy on anyone in the wastelands of rural Atlantis and the above-ground world. No cameras needed. The reflector plate peers out of an invisible, weightless eye that ranges at will. It's been about a decade since Farnsworth, a time during which television's developers have been broadcasting coarsely resolved test images, silhouettes, and barely discernible faces to virtually no one. But the year of Undersea Kingdom is also that of NBC's first genuine live broadcast. For such an early try, it's surprisingly adept. Two men sit desk-bound on a polished wood set, co-hosting a discussion between one another about the medium they're appearing on. This is intercut with a fashion show, an Amos and Andy style comedy routine, and other variety acts. There's also a round robin with the entrepreneurs who helped make it all possible. They stare awkwardly at the lens, an outdoor breeze blowing through their thin hair, and murmur their pride on being present at such an auspicious occasion. Much of what they say is curiously hollow or self-referential. "I trust the machine is doing us justice," murmurs Ed Poor, board chairman of High Grade Sylvania. "We were not selected for our appearance, but for our courage." "It is a pleasure to be one of the original televisitors," adds J.R. Holland of the Philadelphia Storage Battery Company. And he seems to be thinking of himself as something from science fiction, operating in television, a less malicious cousin of H.G. Wells's Martian tripods. They look stage-frightened, these televisitors, though the home TV audience is scarcely big enough to fill a school auditorium. Such business-savvy fellows as they must have an inkling what they're onto with this. After the success of radio, and with moving images as well, maybe they imagine, decades into the future, the billions of gazes that will be lost in this curved glass.
Mr. J.R. Howland of the Philadelphia Storage Battery Company.
It's a pleasure to be one of the early televisitors.